This recording is going to provide an overview of constructivist teaching, which is the style of teaching that we will use for ED 307. Okay, so let's begin by discussing the fact that there's a large consensus among expert researchers on learning and on the brain, and what they believe is that we do not learn by passively receiving and then remembering what we are taught, which is a very traditional approach to teaching and learning, right? Instead, these expert researchers have decided that learning involves actively constructing our own meanings. Literally, it involves the construction of connections between neurons. What happens is that we invent our own concepts and ideas linked to what we already know. And this meaning-making theory is called constructivism. So I don't think that this is a new idea to you, because I know that when you talk about lesson planning, you always talk about introducing a lesson by introducing the content by relating it to previous learning, scaffolding, which is the premise for how this works, okay? When you've learned something, you have changed your brain physically. There's been a physical alteration. We notice this creative meaning-making process mostly when it goes wrong. And here's an example of just, sometimes something that a child might say that might clue you in that maybe they didn't quite understand what it was that you were trying to help them learn, okay? And here's one example. That's something that a child might say. Chaucer wrote many poems and plays and also wrote literature, okay? Because in this sense, that the child didn't understand that literature is poems and plays. And then here's another example. History calls them Romans because they've never stayed in place very long. So in this instance, the child heard Romans and tied that to the meaning by they roam, meaning they move around, and so made that incorrect connection right there. Okay, that's my attempt at humor right there. I'm thinking maybe you didn't get it, but anyway. So these genuine mistakes show meaning-making in practice, okay? If students just remembered what they were told, they wouldn't make mistakes, right? So when we bring kids into our class and we get on our stage and start giving our information giving process that we do in traditional classrooms, they should actually just be able to memorize everything we say, and they wouldn't make mistakes like the two that I just gave, right? They would either remember or they would not. So conceptual errors show that we make our own mental constructs. We don't just remember other people's. So the meaning that one child gets from what they hear could be very different from the meaning that another child gets, because we all compare it with our previous learning, our previous experiences, and then we make our own construct about what that new information actually means. And it's not just children that happens with. It happens with adults too. If you and I went to see a movie together, and we sat through the same 2-hour movie, and then came out of the movie, and somebody said, describe the characters to me, we would not have the exact same descriptions. If somebody said, tell me the meaning of the movie, what was the overall meaning of the movie? It might be close to the same, but it wouldn't necessarily be. And if somebody said, hey, did you like the movie? Maybe I would like it, maybe you didn't like it. But we base that on our previous experiences, and so what we say and what we learn from it could be very different. Even something as simple as asking adults the meaning of democracy, or tell me how to use an apostrophe. Again, the constructs could be very different depending on their experience, prior knowledge, etc. So what that leads to is that it's very important to use teaching methods that require students to form constructs. That means to require them to form their own meaning or interpretation of the material being studied, which is scary for some teachers because they worry about, oh, they're not going to pass the test, they're not going to pass the test. But it's very important in a constructivist classroom that we teach in a way that we allow students to form their own meaning or interpretation of the material. And then, number 2, you got to have this one, we allow the learner and the teacher to detect misconceptions, errors and omissions in the learning, and then correct these. That's the other part of the process that's equally, actually probably, even more important is that you have that reflection at the end, discussion, to make sure that everybody's on the same page and we don't think the Romans are just people that are roaming around. There I go with my totally funny jokes again. Folk psychology. This is going to be the term that we're going to use for traditional ideas about teaching. Unfortunately, most students and many, many, many teachers have a folk psychology view of learning rather than a constructivist view. And this is very, very hard to budge. Folk theory is considered a real obstacle to effective teaching and learning. Basically, what this type of theory of learning assumes is that students are a mug and the teacher is a jug, and the mug is filled by the jug. Knowledge is stuff, the mind is a vessel, learning is storing the stuff inside the vessel, which is a very simplistic view of actually what anyway, this is very simplified. Acquisition merely requires listening, reasonably attentive, you don't even have to pay good attention, or actually just being present where the information giving is taking place. Assessment is simply stock taking, checking to see if they got their answer A, B, C, or D correct. Another analogy is that the teacher is the gas pump attendant filling the students' empty gas tanks. So that is a very traditional view of teaching and learning that is held near and dear by many educators that I'm sure you have experienced in K-12 education and probably even in higher education. But it's not the approach that we're going to take in ED 307, okay? So, constructivist teaching is very brain-friendly teaching, okay? Beliefs behind brain-friendly teaching are that learning requires a stage where students are required to process the information given to them. They need activities which require them to make personal sense of the material, and so they end up constructing their own meanings. Okay? What research shows is that learning activities that require active student processing, that means the student is doing something to make meaning of the material, these activities improve recall by as much as a factor of 10. They are more enjoyed and create deeper learning. Second, meaning is personal and unique. So for every student, the meaning will not necessarily be the same because it's dependent upon their prior learning and experience, which is different from student to student. So there's no one way to learn something, and a variety of tasks and experiences are required to meet individual needs. This is differentiated learning, okay? Providing a variety of tasks, a variety of experiences to help the learning occur, okay? A good example or an analogy that may help you understand this is if we think about teaching a sport or coaching a sport, I guess you would say. And in this analogy, the student is going to be the athlete and the teacher is going to be the coach. Okay? So the coach may explain something to his player, but that's not enough. Coaches don't just explain. What do they do after they explain something? They have the athlete train. They have the athlete practice. They take them out on the field and they go through plays or they go through drills. And then while they're doing that, formative. After they're doing that, summative. The coach provides feedback on the student's performance during the practice, during the game, and based upon that assessment, the coach suggests remedial work. You know, you've got to do better at this, you've got to do better at this, try this. Okay, so that's a good analogy of how a constructivist teaching environment works. Number 3, the brain is a parallel processor, not a sequential processor. And this was introduced in the discussion about teaching digital natives because they are definitely parallel processors. So learners need to think about parts and wholes at the same time and to integrate topics. So an analogy for this would be that we wouldn't go to math class and only learn about math. But during math, we would read information. You know, we may do some word problems and read. And we might actually learn about economics. And tied to economics is social studies. And then tied to social studies is government. And so within our math class, we have an integration of all these different academic areas, which is how the real world actually works. Skills such as higher order thinking need to be taught along with the content. And the reason this is so important is because the students, because they're going to be in charge of getting their own meaning, it's important that they learn how to think so they'll know whether or not they've asked the right questions or found the correct answers, or know what new additional questions they need to ask to be able to continue their learning or direct it in towards different passions. So we have to teach that higher order thinking process. And that comes much easier with younger kids because it hasn't been drilled out of them yet. I find with students in college that higher order thinking is sometimes hard because for so many years you've not been allowed to use higher order thinking skills because you've just been the mug that was filled by the jug, which is a sad happening. And last, learning is enhanced by a challenge. It's weakened by a threat. In talking physiologically, threats release cortisol into our bodies, causing higher order thinking skills to take a back seat. So it's very important that we not threaten the learner, but we find ways to challenge the learner. Okay, so a summary right here of some constructivist teaching strategies. Learning should involve activities to process the new material, linking it to what the student already knows, which is scaffolding. Tasks should be authentic, set in meaningful context, and related to the real world. And I'm going to give you an example of that, just so that you'll understand when I'm talking about authentic tasks and related to the real world. There's this student athlete. He gets a full ride scholarship to a Division I school at playing soccer. And so, you know, sometimes you're required to take those 1-hour activity classes. And this student was required to take a couple of 1-hour activity classes. So he says, you know, I'm a soccer player, so let's take Intro to Soccer, and I'll be able to CLEP that class by just going and taking the test. So the student meets with the teacher of the class and says, you know, I'd like to CLEP this class. You know, what do I need to do? And the teacher says, oh, yeah, that'd be great. So meet me next week, and you've got to do a skills test and a knowledge test, and then, you know, based on your grade, you'll either be allowed to CLEP it or you will not. So the student athlete meets the teacher the next week and says, hey, so I'm ready to do my test. And so the teacher gives the athlete 10 soccer balls and positions him 15 feet away from a block, you know, a brick wall. And on that brick wall, taped about 5 feet up, is a 12 by 12 square, 12 inch by 12 inch square. Okay? And so picture this. You've got the block wall with the 12 inch by 12 inch square taped 5 feet up, and then you've got the student athlete standing 15 feet away with his 10 balls. So the teacher says, okay, so the skills part of this test is that you kick the ball into that square 9 out of 10 times. And if you can do that, you'll have passed this part of the test. And so the soccer kid is thinking, well, I don't know if I can do that, but I'll try. I mean, he's a Division I soccer player and got a full ride scholarship, so ought to be able to pass an intro soccer class. So the student gets back, starts kicking the balls, and, well, he got 1 or 2 in the square, but overall, definitely not 9 or 10. And so the kid says, well, I didn't do so well on that, but I'm a really good soccer player. Well, you didn't pass the test. Folks, how many of you have been out on a soccer field? Have you seen the size of those goals? Where on the soccer field does a soccer player have to kick a ball into a 12 by 12 inch square? Was the task authentic? Was it related to the real world? Absolutely not. Because we know with a constructivist teaching approach, the learning is going to involve errors, because students have different experiences, and so the connections they make, sometimes they're going to involve errors for different learners. So you've got to make sure that all tasks include this part. They must include a self-assessment, correction, peer discussion, teacher feedback, and or reality checks. Now, they don't have to include every one of those in every lesson, but at least one of those in every lesson, because through the peer discussion, you might find who has an error in their learning. Through the correction process, you will learn. Through a self-assessment, the learner may see themselves that they haven't quite learned the information right. Teacher feedback provides information about the learning, or reality check. So that's an essential part of the constructivist teaching approach. Some brain-friendly strategies to make your classroom an even better learning environment on top of using the constructivist approach are these. Your students need to have plenty of water. In brain-friendly classrooms, the teachers allow the students to have water bottles at their desk at all times and to fill them as they need to. Oxygen. The room does not need to be stuffy and needs to be good flow of oxygen. Protein. So if you're going to do snacks for your students, try and opt for a protein-based snack instead of a carbohydrate-based snack. A good diet is important. Rest. Encourage your students to get plenty of rest, and physical exercise as well as brain exercise. And you can do this through integration activities where you integrate content with physical movement. And there's so much information about this out on the internet that you can find these activities already designed for you that will get your students up and learning and moving, which is really great. Research says that learning drops off by 20% if you eat excessive carbohydrates, because this causes the release of serotonin into our blood, which relaxes us and makes us want to do what? Sleep. Yeah, you've eaten lunch, a carby lunch, and then walked into class, and what do you want to do? You want to sleep, not learn, okay? Full focus can be attained for the same number of minutes as your age, okay? So, if you're teaching, I'm going to say 6th graders, who I guess would be about 12 maybe, that means they can keep full focus for up to 12 minutes at a time, okay? If you're teaching 13-year-olds, full focus for 13 minutes at a time, and then they need to have that processing time. And what happens during the processing time? What are they doing? Sleeping, reading, what are they doing? They're practicing, they're using, applying whatever the information was. And so full focus can be attained for the same number of minutes as your age, up to 20 to 25 minutes max. So, even though I am in my 40s, that doesn't mean that I could sit through a 40-minute lecture and maintain full focus. It maxes out at 20 to 25 minutes, and then your brain needs time to churn and process and, file that information. And during that time, you need to be practicing and applying and using the information. Short breaks and changes also help students to focus. Okay, so here's some things that you can use in your class to make the constructivist approach work, okay? Teaching by asking is a great way to do it. Instead of teaching by telling, which is what is done in a traditional class, you teach by asking. You ask the questions and make the students find the answers, which is a lot of what we're going to be doing in ED 307. Okay? You can use peer explanation and jigsaw methods. If you're not familiar with those, you need to look them up. Jigsaw method, I taught that at a conference not long ago. And in that method, that's where students in the class all learn different pieces of the information, and they all bring it back together, and they put all their information together to form the whole of the information. Diagnostic questions and answers. Ask diagnostic questions and answers. Use wrong answers to explore correct misunderstandings. Use Socratic questioning. So this is questioning that cannot be answered yes or no. It's questioning that provides thought and leads to additional questions many times. Use thought-provoking tasks and questions that are high on Bloom's taxonomy. So instead of saying, do you know or do you understand, use analysis type questions like, why would you do this? Why would you do that? Use synthesis type questioning. How could you do this? How could you do that? Or use evaluation type questions, which are judgment questions. These higher order questions require students to construct their own conceptions of the new material. You can't reason with material until you have conceptualized it. So questions that require reasoning force conceptualization. So they have to understand to be able to answer higher order questions. Okay? Use case studies that relate the topic to real life, or use former experiences or former learning. Use group work, requiring students to discuss the material so that peer teaching and peer checking takes place. As we know, learning involves pattern making. So use things like mind maps and summaries that point out the relation of the parts of a topic to the whole. Also point out the relation of today's topics to other topics. Relating today to history. That's a great way to do. Teach skills in the context of the topic of your subject. Think of yourself as a skills teacher who uses content to teach the skills. Stimulation increases the learning rate, so make sure that you use rich, multisensory resources, lively activities that generate a sense of fun whenever you can. Okay, so this is a brief introduction to get you started thinking about constructivism and what it is.